There is a line at the very beginning of the Call of Cthulhu that most people read right past. And I think that's a shame, because it might be the most quietly devastating sentence in American literature. Lovecraft wrote it in 1926, sitting in Providence, Rhode Island, broke and recently returned from 2 years in New York that had nearly destroyed him. And before he tells you anything about the story, before the dead professor, before the cult in the swamp, before the thing that rises from the ocean, he opens with this. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Sit with that for a second. He's saying that the only reason we're okay, the only reason any of us can get out of bed and function and go about our lives, is because our brains can't connect all the dots. That ignorance, it's a kindness. The only thing standing between us and something we wouldn't survive knowing. A whole philosophy packed into one sentence, and understanding that philosophy is what this video is about. We will get into the story itself and go deep on it, but there's context you need first about the man who wrote it, the world he was living in, and the idea he was building, because without that, you're only getting half of what this story actually is. So let's start at the beginning. If you've been following the channel, you already know this story. We did a full narration of the Call of Cthulhu. Link is in the description. If you haven't listened yet, go do that first. Come back here after. It'll make everything we're about to talk about land a lot harder. In this video, we're going to pull the story apart and look at what's actually inside it, where it came from, what it meant in 1926, what it means now, and why nearly 100 years later it still has a grip on horror, literature, film, gaming, and just about every dark corner of popular culture you can name. The Call of Cthulhu changed what horror was allowed to be, and most people have no idea why. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island. And from the very beginning, his life had a darkness to it that felt almost engineered. When he was 3 years old, his father Winfield suffered a complete psychotic break in a Chicago hotel room while on a business trip. He was brought back to Providence and committed to Butler Hospital, a psychiatric institution, where he stayed until his death 5 years later. The official story given to young Howard was that his father was paralyzed and comatose. The reality, pieced together by biographers later, was almost certainly neurosyphilis, a late-stage bacterial infection of the brain that causes psychosis, paralysis, and eventually death. So Lovecraft grew up without a father, in a house run by his mother and 2 aunts, under the roof of his maternal grandfather, Whipple Phillips, a prominent businessman who became the dominant male figure in his life. His grandfather fed him Greek mythology, Arabian Nights, gothic tales told off the cuff at bedtime. The weird, the ancient, and the dark were essentially his nursery. He was a prodigy, reading at 3, writing poems at 6. By 8, he had discovered science, first chemistry, then astronomy. He started publishing his own handwritten journals about astronomical observations before he was 10 years old. But he was also sick, constantly, frequently kept home from school with illnesses that doctors struggled to diagnose, many of which biographers now believe were psychosomatic. His body expressing anxiety his mind had no other outlet for. He was lonely, isolated, and intensely interior, the kind of child who lives almost entirely inside his own head because the outside world has given him very little reason to trust it. And then, when he was 13, his grandfather died. Whipple Phillips was the financial backbone of the family and the emotional center of Lovecraft's world. When he died in 1904, the money largely dried up. The family was forced to leave their large home and move into a smaller house. For a 13-year-old boy who had already lost his father to madness and spent most of his childhood sick and isolated, it was another piece of the floor giving way beneath him. His mother began showing signs of severe psychological instability around this time as well. She was controlling, anxious, and by several accounts told young Howard repeatedly that he was ugly, that his face was strange, unsettling to look at. He believed her. He carried that with him for the rest of his life. But through all of it, there were the stars. Lovecraft had been a serious amateur astronomer since childhood, regularly visiting the Ladd Observatory in Providence and publishing his own astronomical observations in local newspapers while still a teenager. And the more he learned about the universe, the more a specific feeling took hold of him, one he couldn't shake and eventually stopped trying to. The universe was incomprehensibly vast. It had existed for billions of years before humans arrived. It would continue for billions more after we were gone. The stars he was studying had no awareness of him, no interest in him. The cosmos wasn't hostile, it was simply indifferent. Utterly, completely, perfectly indifferent. Most people encounter that idea and find a way to make peace with it. Lovecraft encountered it at 13, in the wreckage of his family's fortune, with a destabilized mother and a dead grandfather, and it didn't frighten him so much as confirm something he already suspected. The world was not built for human beings. We just happened to end up in it. By the time he was 17, he had read enough philosophy and science to have built that feeling into something more structured. He became an atheist, a materialist, and a pessimist in the clinical sense, not dramatic or performative about it, just genuinely convinced that the universe operated like a machine, with no operator and no purpose and no interest in anything we did or felt or built. He called it, eventually, cosmic indifferentism, and he spent the rest of his life writing fiction about what it feels like to be proven right. In March 1924, Lovecraft did something nobody who knew him would have predicted. He got married and moved to New York City. Her name was Sonia Green. She was a successful businesswoman, a pulp fiction writer, 7 years his senior, and by all accounts, warm, vivacious, and socially confident. Essentially, everything Lovecraft was not. They had met through shared involvement in amateur press circles. He was 33 years old, had never held a job, had barely left Providence, and had spent most of his adult life in his mother's house writing letters and stories that almost nobody was reading. New York was supposed to be a fresh start. It was a disaster. Sonia's business collapsed shortly after the move. She fell ill. Lovecraft tried to find work and couldn't. A 34-year-old man with no employment history, no degree, and a personality calibrated entirely for solitude and correspondence was not an easy hire in a city moving at that speed. He lost around 40 pounds. He moved into a cramped apartment in Brooklyn Heights on a weekly allowance Sonia sent from wherever her work had taken her. He was, for long stretches, essentially alone in one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and the city itself repelled him in a way that went beyond simple discomfort. New York in the mid-1920s was a city in dramatic demographic transformation. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans north from the South. Waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had reshaped entire neighborhoods. The city was loud, crowded, multiracial, and alive in a way that Lovecraft found genuinely unbearable. His letters from this period are where his racism is at its most raw and most ugly. He described the streets of Brooklyn in terms that are difficult to read. He wrote about the people around him, immigrants, Black New Yorkers, anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of Anglo-Saxon New England, with a contempt and a fear that went well beyond what was considered normal, even by the already low standards of 1920s America. His own wife, Sonia, who was Jewish, later wrote that whenever they found themselves in racially mixed crowds, Lovecraft would become livid with rage. She said he seemed almost to lose his mind. This needs to be said plainly. Lovecraft was a racist, deeply, genuinely, and in ways that went beyond the ambient prejudice of his era. His biographers have documented it thoroughly. His letters make it undeniable, and it matters for understanding his work, because the fear that runs through the Call of Cthulhu, the dread of ancient forces breaking through the thin surface of civilization, the horror of encountering something vast and incomprehensible that operates by completely different rules, that fear has a personal dimension. The world Lovecraft encountered in New York terrified him, and some of that terror found its way into the story. That doesn't make the racism acceptable. It makes it worth understanding, because you can't fully understand what he built without knowing what he was afraid of, and how much of that fear was aimed at other human beings. By early 1926, he was done. His aunts wrote and invited him back to Providence. He packed his things, essentially abandoned his marriage, and got on a train home. His friend, W. Paul Cook, who met him at the station, described him as the happiest man he had ever seen. He was 35 years old, penniless, and about to write the most important horror story of the 20th century. Lovecraft arrived back in Providence on April 17th, 1926. He moved in with his aunts, settled back into the city he loved, and within months produced a burst of writing that included some of the most celebrated weird fiction ever put to paper. The Call of Cthulhu was written that summer, August and September 1926. Less than 6 months after he stepped off that train. It's worth sitting with that timeline for a moment. The story that would go on to define an entire genre of horror, inspire generations of writers, filmmakers, and artists, and introduce one of the most recognizable monsters in all of fiction, was written by a broke, recently separated, psychologically battered man in his mid-30s, living with his elderly aunts in the city he had fled to because he had nowhere else to go. Lovecraft himself considered it middling work. When he submitted it to Weird Tales, the editor initially rejected it as too obscure. It only got published after a friend intervened on his behalf. It ran in the February 1928 issue and earned Lovecraft 1 cent per word, a total of $110. He died 9 years later, largely unknown, from intestinal cancer complicated by malnutrition. He was 46. The world caught up with him after he was gone, and by then he couldn't have cared less, which, given everything he believed about the indifference of the universe, feels almost fitting. To understand why the Call of Cthulhu hit the way it did, you need to understand what 1926 actually felt like to live in. The world had just survived the First World War, a conflict that killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people and introduced industrial-scale slaughter to human civilization. Poison gas, machine guns, trenches full of bodies. The war didn't just kill people, it killed a particular idea. The idea that progress was inevitable, that civilization was advancing, that science and reason were leading humanity somewhere better. And then, right in the middle of all that wreckage, came Einstein. Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity in 1915, and by the early 1920s it had filtered out of academic circles and into popular consciousness in a way that genuinely unsettled people. Not because they understood it, most didn't, but because of what it seemed to be saying. For roughly 250 years, the scientific framework most educated people operated inside was Newtonian physics. Space was absolute. Time was absolute. The universe ran like a vast, predictable clock with fixed laws that applied everywhere equally. It was orderly, comprehensible, stable. Einstein's relativity dissolved all of that. Space and time were relative to the observer. They bent and warped depending on gravity and velocity. There were no absolutes of time or space, only relationships between things. Historian Paul Johnson described the cultural impact in stark terms, writing that at the beginning of the 1920s the belief began to circulate, for the first time at popular level, that there were no longer any absolutes. of time and space, of good and evil, of knowledge, above all, of value. Lovecraft was paying attention. In a letter written in 1923, he pointed directly to Einstein's relativity as throwing the world into chaos and making the cosmos a jest. The foundations he had built his pessimism on, a cold, mechanical, orderly universe governed by fixed natural laws, were themselves now uncertain. The ground was moving, and Lovecraft, already convinced that human beings were cosmically insignificant, found in that instability not despair but confirmation. The universe was stranger than anyone had been willing to admit. He put that strangeness into the architecture of Relevance. To appreciate what Lovecraft actually built, you need to know what he was building against. Horror in the 19th and early 20th century was, broadly speaking, a moral genre. The monsters had reasons. Dracula was evil, consciously, deliberately, personally evil. He wanted things. He pursued people. He could be defeated. Frankenstein's creature was a tragedy of hubris and abandonment, but it operated within a recognizable human emotional framework. Ghost stories were about unresolved business, injustice, the dead demanding acknowledgement from the living. Even Poe, who Lovecraft idolized and who came closer than almost anyone to what Lovecraft would eventually do, kept his horrors intimate and personal. The terror in Poe is always about a specific mind, a specific guilt, a specific relationship between people. The common thread running through all of it was that the horror meant something. It came from somewhere human. It pointed back at us, our sins, our fears, our failures, our mortality. Lovecraft looked at that tradition and asked a different question entirely. What if the horror has nothing to do with us? What if there are things out there so ancient, so vast, so fundamentally alien that they don't register human beings as significant in any way? Just forces, operating on scales we can't perceive, with motivations we couldn't begin to translate into language, toward ends we will never understand. What if the scariest thing in the universe has no opinion of you whatsoever? That was the rupture Lovecraft introduced. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's everywhere in modern horror, science fiction, and dark fantasy. The indifferent cosmos. The ancient evil that was here long before us and will be here long after. The idea that knowledge itself is dangerous, that understanding too much is a one-way door to madness. All of that traces back to one man, sitting in Providence in the summer of 1926, writing on a typewriter he hated, for money he desperately needed, about a dead god sleeping at the bottom of the ocean. Lovecraft had a name for his philosophy. He called it cosmic indifferentism, though it's more commonly referred to now as cosmicism. And it's worth taking the time to understand what it actually says, because it gets summarized too quickly by most people, and the summary loses what makes it genuinely disturbing. The easy version is, humans are insignificant in the universe. And sure, that's technically true, but that framing makes it sound like a motivational poster in reverse, a reminder to stay humble. That's not what Lovecraft meant, and it's not what makes cosmicism unsettling. Here's the more accurate version. Cosmicism holds that the universe is not only vast beyond human comprehension, but that it operates according to principles our minds were never built to understand. Human cognition evolved for one purpose: survival on a small planet in a specific range of environments, on a timescale of decades. Our brains are tools shaped by millions of years of natural selection for a very particular job, and that job has nothing to do with comprehending the true nature of reality. So when we look at the universe and try to make sense of it, we're not getting closer to the truth. We're getting a heavily filtered, severely limited version of something our nervous systems were never designed to process. The map is not the territory. And the territory, if we could actually perceive it, would be incompatible with sanity. That's the first part, The second part is what separates cosmicism from plain nihilism. Nihilism says nothing matters. Cosmicism says something potentially far worse, that things may well matter enormously, on scales and in ways that have nothing to do with us. And we are simply too small and too brief and too cognitively limited to have any access to what those things are. There may be meaning out there, we just can't reach it. We're the amoeba trying to understand the motivations of the human, looking at it through a microscope. Lovecraft wrote in a letter that all his tales were based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. Not that they're wrong, not that they're evil, just that they don't apply, the way traffic laws don't apply in deep space. There's a question worth sitting with here. Why is indifference scarier than malevolence? Because on the surface it seems like it shouldn't be. A universe that actively wants to destroy you sounds more frightening than one that simply doesn't notice you. A monster that hunts you is more immediately threatening than one that doesn't know you exist. But think about it from a different angle. If the universe is malevolent, if there are forces out there that want to harm you specifically, then you matter. You're a target, which means you're significant. There's a relationship, and where there's a relationship, there's the possibility of negotiation, resistance, escape. Every religion ever conceived by human beings is essentially a framework for managing that relationship. Pray to the right God, follow the right rules, perform the right rituals, and maybe whatever is out there will spare you. The malevolent universe is terrifying, but it's also, in a strange way, comforting. Because it means we're worth something to it. The indifferent universe offers no such comfort. Cthulhu doesn't want to destroy humanity. Cthulhu doesn't want anything from humanity, in any sense we could recognize as wanting. When the creature stirs and its influence bleeds into the dreams of sensitive people across the globe, driving some of them mad, it's incidental. The way you might accidentally step on an ant without ever knowing it was there. Lovecraft's scholar S.T. Joshi put it plainly. The cosmic forces in Lovecraft's fiction have as little regard for humanity as humans have for insects. And that's the thing about insects. We don't hate them. We don't hunt them. We barely think about them. We just live our lives and occasionally, without meaning to, end theirs. That dynamic, the complete absence of recognition, is what Lovecraft understood as the truest form of horror. And it's what the Call of Cthulhu is built on from the ground up. So now go back to that opening line. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. When Lovecraft wrote that, he wasn't being dramatic. He was stating his actual position on the human condition. The word merciful is doing enormous work in that sentence. Mercy implies something that could have gone the other way, something that was spared. Lovecraft is saying that our cognitive limitations, the fact that we can't hold all available information in mind at once, can't connect every dot, can't perceive the full picture of what the universe actually is. That limitation is a gift, an accidental, impersonal gift from a universe that didn't intend to give it. He continues, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The island is everything human civilization has ever built. Every religion, every scientific framework, every philosophy, every story we've ever told ourselves about who we are and why we're here. All of it is a small patch of dry land surrounded by something we can't see the edges of and were never meant to cross. And the story he's about to tell you is about what happens when someone accidentally voyages too far. That's the engine the whole thing runs on. And now that you understand the philosophy behind it, the man who built it, and the world he was building it in, we can finally get into the story itself. The Call of Cthulhu is a structurally unusual story. and that's not an accident. Most horror stories are linear. Something happens, then something else happens. Tension builds, the horror arrives, the story ends. You're in one perspective, moving forward in time, experiencing events as they unfold. It's the narrative equivalent of walking down a dark hallway. Lovecraft does something completely different. The story is told in 3 nested layers, each one discovered inside the previous one like a set of Russian dolls. The narrator, a man named Francis Thurston, begins by going through the papers of his recently deceased granduncle, a professor of Semitic languages at Brown University. Inside those papers, he finds 2 separate accounts from 2 completely different people, in 2 completely different parts of the world, describing encounters with the same thing. And inside one of those accounts is a 3rd account, a sailor's manuscript describing a direct encounter with something on an island that shouldn't exist. Nobody in this story experiences the full picture in real time. Everything arrives second-hand or third-hand, reconstructed from documents and notes and testimonies of people who are mostly already dead by the time we're reading their words. That architecture is deliberate, and it's doing specific psychological work. Lovecraft understood that the most unsettling way to reveal something is gradually, through accumulation, through the slow convergence of separate pieces of evidence that were never supposed to connect. Each layer of the story adds another piece. And the horror isn't in any single piece. It's in the moment the narrator realizes what the pieces add up to, which is exactly what the opening line warned you about. The inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents is a mercy. What Thurston is doing across the entire length of this story is correlating, connecting dots that were scattered across different continents, different decades, different disciplines. And the picture that emerges from that process is the thing that costs him his peace of mind permanently. Lovecraft makes the act of reading the story mirror the act of discovery inside the story. You are doing exactly what Thurston is doing, assembling something you probably shouldn't. The first layer of the story involves 2 things happening simultaneously in completely separate parts of the world that have no obvious reason to be connected. In Providence, Rhode Island, a young art student named Henry Wilcox begins having vivid, disturbing dreams. He shows up at Professor Angel's door with a bas-relief sculpture he made, a crude, vaguely organic figure covered in unreadable hieroglyphs, and says he made it in a dream. He describes cyclopean cities, vast and wrong, built to geometries that don't correspond to anything in human architecture. He's feverish, agitated. He can't fully explain what he experienced, but he can't stop thinking about it either. At roughly the same time, a police inspector named Legrasse had previously brought a nearly identical idol to an academic conference, recovered from a raid on a cult operating in the swamps of Louisiana. The cult members, described by Lovecraft in terms that reflect his racism directly and uglily, it should be said, were performing rituals around the idol, chanting in a language nobody could identify, worshipping something they called Cthulhu. 2 separate incidents, 2 identical objects, 2 groups of people with no connection to each other, responding to the same thing. And when Professor Angel starts pulling on that thread, he discovers it goes further, much further. Artists across Europe were having the same dreams around the same time. Psychiatric hospitals recorded unusual spikes in admissions. A painter in Paris submitted a piece to a gallery called Dream Landscape that disturbed everyone who looked at it without anyone being able to say exactly why. This detail, the global simultaneous nature of Cthulhu's influence, is one of the most quietly terrifying things in the story, and it tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic sequences that come later. What Lovecraft is describing is something that operates below the threshold of conscious human awareness, reaching into the minds of sensitive individuals across the entire planet at once. The dreams don't discriminate by nationality or language or class. They arrive in Providence and Paris and the Louisiana Bayou with equal indifference. There's a concept in neuroscience called sleep architecture, the idea that human sleep follows predictable patterns of brain activity, cycling through stages that serve specific biological and psychological functions. REM sleep, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming, involves a distinct pattern of neural activity, where the brain is highly active, but the body is paralyzed. It's a state of unusual vulnerability. The conscious mind's filters are down, and Lovecraft, writing decades before modern sleep science, chose that specific state as the vector for Cthulhu's influence. The thing reaches you when you're least defended, and you don't even know it's happening until the picture starts to come together. When the sailors in the third layer of the story finally reach the island, Lovecraft describes it in terms that have become some of the most referenced language in all of weird fiction. He calls the architecture cyclopean. He describes angles that seem simultaneously acute and obtuse. He talks about geometry that the human eye processes correctly, but the human brain refuses to accept. And he uses a specific phrase that gets repeated throughout the sequence: non-Euclidean geometry. That phrase gets thrown around a lot in discussions of Lovecraft. It's become almost a shorthand for weird and wrong in a cosmic way. But it's worth understanding what it actually means, because Lovecraft chose it deliberately, and the real mathematics behind it is genuinely strange enough to earn its place in a horror story. Euclidean geometry is the geometry most of us learned in school. It's named after the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid, who codified it around 300 BC. In Euclidean geometry, parallel lines never meet. The angles of a triangle always add up to exactly 180 degrees. Space is flat, consistent, and behaves the same way everywhere. It's the geometry of the world as we experience it at human scales, the geometry of rooms and roads and buildings. Non-Euclidean geometry describes spaces where those rules don't hold. There are two main types. In spherical geometry, which describes the surface of a sphere, parallel lines eventually converge, and the angles of a triangle add up to more than 180 degrees. In hyperbolic geometry, the opposite is true. Parallel lines diverge, and triangles have angles that add up to less than 180 degrees. These geometries aren't theoretical abstractions. They're physically real. Einstein's general theory of relativity describes space-time itself as non-Euclidean, curved and warped by the presence of mass and energy. So when Lovecraft describes Arlia as built on non-Euclidean geometry, he's not just reaching for a phrase that sounds impressively technical. He's saying that the city operates according to the actual physics of curved space-time, rather than the flat geometry human brains evolved to navigate. The sailors aren't just confused because the architecture is strange. They're confused because their nervous systems are encountering a spatial environment they were never built to process. The wrongness they feel, it's neurological. There's a real phenomenon called spatial disorientation that pilots and deep-sea divers experience when their sensory inputs conflict with each other, when what the eyes see contradicts what the inner ear feels, producing intense nausea, confusion, and in extreme cases, complete loss of the ability to determine which way is up or down. Lovecraft's sailors are experiencing something in that family, but more profound and more permanent. Really, it doesn't just disorient them. It breaks the cognitive framework they use to understand space itself. And that matters because of what it implies about Cthulhu and the Great Old Ones more broadly. They didn't build Arlie for human visitors. They built it for themselves, for beings whose perception of space and time and physics operates on completely different terms than ours. The city isn't trying to be incomprehensible. It's just built for its actual inhabitants. The horror is incidental. The wrongness the sailors experience is the architectural equivalent of a human being trying to navigate a space designed for a creature with completely different sensory organs and a completely different relationship to physical reality. Lovecraft was also drawing on something very specific from his reading. In 1926, shortly before writing the story, he had been reading theosophical texts about Atlantis and Lemuria, ancient lost civilizations that theosophists believed had possessed knowledge and technology far beyond modern understanding. He took that framework and inverted it. Where the theosophists saw lost wisdom as something noble and aspirational, Lovecraft recast it as something deeply threatening. The ancient civilization in his story wasn't advanced in any way that would benefit humanity. It was advanced in ways that made humanity irrelevant. Relia sits at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, thrust up temporarily by a seismic event, real enough to stand on and walk through, but wrong enough to make standing and walking feel like acts of profound violation. It's a place that exists in our world but wasn't made for it. A piece of somewhere else, briefly and accidentally surfaced, and somewhere inside it, behind a door that opens in ways that don't make geometric sense, something is waiting. The moment Cthulhu actually appears in the story is surprisingly brief. For a creature that has become one of the most recognizable monsters in all of fiction, endlessly depicted in art, film, games, merchandise, and popular culture for nearly 100 years, Lovecraft gives you remarkably little to work with. He describes something enormous, something that combines qualities of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature in ways that don't resolve into a coherent image. A rubbery, pulpy body, a tentacled face, vast clawed wings, eyes that do something to the people who look into them. And then it moves, and the sailors start dying, and the one man who survives does so by ramming a boat directly into the creature's head, which regenerates immediately, as though the damage was a minor inconvenience, and fleeing at full speed while it pursues them across the water, before eventually, for reasons the story doesn't fully explain, losing interest and sinking back beneath the surface. The whole sequence is maybe 4 or 5 pages. In a story of 30 or so, the thing the entire narrative has been building toward gets less page time than the cult in the Louisiana swamp, and that is entirely intentional. Lovecraft wrote extensively about his theory of horror in an essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature, which he was working on around the same period he wrote The Call of Cthulhu. His central argument was that the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. The moment you fully describe something, you have made it known. You have given it edges, boundaries, a shape the mind can hold and therefore, on some level, begin to process and accept. The most frightening version of any monster is always the one you haven't quite seen yet. This is something modern neuroscience actually supports. There's a well-documented psychological phenomenon called the uncanny valley, originally identified by Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori in 1970, which describes the intense discomfort humans feel when something appears almost human, but not quite right. The effect is most powerful in that in-between zone, where the brain is simultaneously pattern matching to something familiar and registering that something is deeply wrong. Full recognition resolves the discomfort. Partial recognition amplifies it. Lovecraft was operating on a version of that principle, but applied more broadly. He was creating something almost describable, something that sits at the edge of what language can do, where the words reach but don't quite close around the thing they're pointing at. Octopus, dragon, human caricature. Notice that those aren't a description. They're 3 separate pattern-matching attempts that all partially fire and none of them complete. Your brain tries octopus and gets partway there, tries dragon and gets partway there, tries human and gets partway there. And the composite image never resolves because it wasn't meant to. The sailors who see Cthulhu directly either die or lose their minds. The one who survives and writes the account that eventually reaches Thurston does so because he never fully looked. He was moving, panicking, focused on the boat and the water and getting away. He experienced Cthulhu the way you experience something in peripheral vision, present and overwhelming, but never fully resolved into a complete picture. Lovecraft understood something that a lot of horror writers before him had missed. Showing the monster too clearly is always a mistake, because the human imagination, left with incomplete information and a strong emotional signal, will generate something more terrifying than anything a writer can fully construct. The reader's own mind becomes a collaborator in the horror, and your mind knows exactly what scares you most. He just gave it the raw materials and pointed it in the right direction. Here's something worth considering. Nobody in this story is threatened in the way horror protagonists usually are. Nobody is stalked. Nobody is hunted. Nobody is in immediate physical danger for most of the narrative. The sailors who encounter Cthulhu directly are the exception, and even they stumble into it almost by accident. Francis Thurston, the narrator, the man whose experience we're actually following, he never gets anywhere near Relevance. He spends the entire story in libraries and offices and drawing rooms, reading documents, cross-referencing accounts, writing letters. The most physically demanding thing he does is travel to a few cities to follow up on leads. And by the end of it, he is permanently, irreparably changed. Not because anything happened to him, because of what he now knows. That's the horror Lovecraft was actually interested in. The horror of understanding. There's a concept in psychology called apophenia, the tendency of the human mind to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things, to find patterns in noise. It's the same cognitive mechanism that makes us see faces in clouds or hear voices in static. In small doses, it's a normal feature of human cognition. In extreme forms, it's associated with certain psychotic disorders, where the pattern recognition system goes into overdrive and begins generating connections that aren't there. But what Lovecraft is asking in this story is a different and more unsettling question. What if the pattern is real? What if the connections Thurston is drawing between the Louisiana cult and the Providence art student and the Paris painter and the Norwegian sailor aren't apophenia at all? What if they're accurate observations of something that actually exists and actually operates across all of those separate contexts simultaneously? The horror of apophenia is finding meaning that isn't there. The horror Lovecraft is building is finding meaning that is there, that has always been there, that was there long before you started looking, and realizing that you were only ever safe because you hadn't looked carefully enough. Thurston doesn't go mad. That's another thing people often get wrong about this story. He doesn't end up in an asylum. He finishes his account, he publishes it, or tries to, and he continues to exist in the world. But he ends the story hoping that he will be destroyed before the pattern completes itself any further. He doesn't want to know more. He has already learned enough to understand that more knowledge in this direction leads somewhere he won't come back from intact. Lovecraft wrote in his cosmicist philosophy that happiness is achievable only through ignorance, that the examined universe, pursued far enough, terminates in something the human mind wasn't built to survive. Thurston has examined just enough to believe that completely, and the tragedy of his position is that he can't unlearn what he knows. The dots are connected. The picture is assembled. The island may have sunk back beneath the Pacific, and Cthulhu may be sleeping again, but Thurston knows it's there. He knows the cult is still out there. He knows the dreams will come back. He knows the next seismic event is only a matter of time. He is a man living on an island that he now knows is surrounded by an ocean, in a way that he didn't fully understand before and can never ununderstand again. The merciful inability to correlate has been taken from him. and nothing that follows can give it back. Most horror stories end with resolution. The monster is defeated, the haunting is laid to rest, the survivor escapes and rebuilds. Even tragic horror usually offers some form of finality. The thing is over, one way or another, and the surviving characters can begin the process of returning to something like a normal life. Thurston's arc moves in the opposite direction. He begins the story as a skeptic, a rational, educated, professionally cautious man who approaches his granduncle's papers with the assumption that there's a mundane explanation for all of it. He's almost dismissive at first. He suspects the art student Wilcox of manufacturing the whole thing for attention. He sets aside the more disturbing documents with what he describes as callous rationalism. He is, at the start, exactly the kind of person who reads about cults in swamps and thinks, interesting folklore, probably some form of mass hysteria, nothing to lose sleep over. And Lovecraft spends the entire story methodically dismantling that position. Each piece of evidence Thurston examines is individually explicable. The dreams could be coincidence. The cult could be an isolated group of disturbed people. The idol could be a piece of folk art. The sailor's account could be the product of delirium or fabrication. At every stage, there is a rational exit available, a way to close the folder and walk away and go back to the placid island. Thurston doesn't take any of them. Not out of recklessness or thrill-seeking, but because the accumulation of evidence reaches a point where the rational exits start to feel less honest than the terrifying conclusion. A good mind, presented with enough converging data points, eventually has to follow where they lead. And Thurston is a good mind. There's something almost classical about that arc. It echoes the structure of a Greek tragedy, where the protagonist's defining virtue, in this case, intellectual honesty, the commitment to following evidence regardless of where it leads, is precisely what destroys his peace of mind. He couldn't have stopped himself from connecting the dots. That's who he is, and who he is made the outcome inevitable. By the end of the story, he has done something remarkable and terrible. He has assembled a complete and accurate picture of a reality that operates entirely outside human significance. He knows that Cthulhu exists. He knows it has existed for hundreds of millions of years. He knows it will exist for hundreds of millions more. He knows that the entire span of human civilization, every war, every empire, every invention, every work of art, every life ever lived, occupies a footnote in a story that has nothing to do with us. And he knows that Cthulhu is sleeping, not dead. That the phrase the cult chants, Funglui Magluanaf, Cthulhu Relie, Gahnaglftarn, translates to, in his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, not gone, waiting. The story ends not with escape, but with dread of continuation. Thurston isn't afraid of what just happened. He's afraid of what comes next, of what he might learn if he keeps pulling the thread, of what might find him now that he's been paying attention. He ends the story hoping for oblivion, hoping that he will be destroyed before the full picture assembles itself any further. That is a man who has understood something and found that understanding worse than the alternative. Lovecraft once wrote in a letter that there is nothing better than oblivion, since in oblivion there is no wish unfulfilled. He wrote that years before the Call of Cthulhu. By the time he sat down to write Thurston's final lines, he had found a way to put that feeling into fiction with a precision that still lands nearly 100 years later. The Call of Cthulhu was published in 1928. The world it was written into, post-war, post-Einstein, anxious and destabilized, has been replaced by something that would have been unrecognizable to Lovecraft. And yet, the story hasn't aged. If anything, it feels more relevant now than it did when it first appeared in Weird Tales for 1 cent a word. It's worth asking why. We live in an information environment of almost incomprehensible density. At At any given moment, on the device in your pocket, you have access to more raw data about the state of the world than any human being in history has ever had access to. News from every continent in real time, scientific research from every discipline, the private opinions of billions of people, the documented suffering of populations you will never meet in places you will never visit. For reasons that trace back through decades of history, you don't have time to fully understand. The human brain was not built for this. We evolved in small groups, processing information about a bounded physical environment. The cognitive tools we use to make sense of the world, pattern recognition, emotional response to threat, the impulse to find narrative and meaning in events, those tools were calibrated for a scale of reality far smaller than the one we now inhabit. We are running ancient hardware on a system that has expanded far beyond its original parameters. Lovecraft's island of ignorance has been shrinking for 100 years, and the black seas pressing in around it have never been wider or darker or more full of things that resist easy understanding. The idea that knowledge beyond a certain threshold becomes dangerous, that correlating too many contents of the human mind produces something the mind wasn't designed to survive. That idea maps onto the modern experience of information overload in a way that feels less like metaphor and more like diagnosis. There are genuine psychological studies documenting the mental health effects of sustained news consumption. Anxiety disorders, depression, a pervasive sense of helplessness in the face of systems too large and too complex for any individual to meaningfully influence. The clinical term is sometimes doom scrolling, which is a glib name for something that Lovecraft would have recognized immediately. We are all thirsting now to varying degrees, sitting with our documents, cross-referencing our sources, watching the dots connect into a picture that is larger and stranger and more indifferent to our well-being than we were prepared for. And there's something else. Science, in the nearly 100 years since Lovecraft wrote this story, has done nothing to make the cosmos feel less alien. Quite the opposite. We now know that the observable universe is approximately 93 billion light-years in diameter. We know it has existed for roughly 13.8 billion years. We know that the matter making up stars, planets, and human beings accounts for only about 5% of what the universe actually contains, the rest being dark matter and dark energy, substances we have detected only by their gravitational effects and whose fundamental nature remains completely unknown. We know that time itself behaves differently depending on gravity and velocity. We know that at the quantum scale, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, that causality gets strange, that the rules our nervous systems were built to navigate simply don't apply. The universe Lovecraft was gesturing at with his fiction, vast, indifferent, operating according to principles the human mind strains to process, turns out to be, by the best measurements available, roughly accurate. He wasn't writing fantasy. He was writing a very specific kind of realism, dressed in the language of monsters and cults and sleeping gods, for an audience that wasn't ready to hear it stated plainly. Some of them still aren't. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died on March 15th, 1937. He was 46 years old, largely unknown outside of a small circle of pulp fiction readers and amateur press correspondents. He died in pain from intestinal cancer complicated by malnutrition. In the city he had never really been able to leave. He left behind no significant estate, no family, and no expectation that his work would survive him in any meaningful way. Two of his friends, August Derleth and Donald Wandre, spent years after his death collecting his scattered publications and correspondence and founding a small press called Arkham House, specifically to preserve them. Without that effort, it's genuinely possible that most of what Lovecraft wrote would have been lost entirely. Pulp magazine fiction from the 1920s and 30s was not considered worth preserving by anyone with institutional power or resources. Instead, something else happened. The work found its readers. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum that has never really stopped. Stephen King has called Lovecraft the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale. Jorge Luis Borges dedicated a story to his memory. Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, Thomas Ligotti, Jeff Vandermeer. The list of writers who cite him as a foundational influence reads like a syllabus for the last 100 years of dark fiction. The Cthulhu mythos he built has been expanded by dozens of writers, adapted into films, games, comics, and music, and referenced so pervasively in popular culture that the word Lovecraftian has entered the language as its own descriptor. Arkham, the fictional Massachusetts city Lovecraft invented, became the name of the asylum in Batman. That's how deep the roots go. And through all of it, the Call of Cthulhu sits at the center, the founding document, the story where the philosophy became fiction, where the broken man from Providence put his particular understanding of the universe into a form that turned out to be more durable than anyone, including him, could have imagined. There is an irony in that which Lovecraft himself would have appreciated in his dry and mordant way. A man who believed that nothing humanity produced had any significance in the cosmos at large, that oblivion was the most honest outcome available, that the universe had no interest in preserving anything we made. That man produced something that has outlasted him by nearly 90 years and shows no signs of stopping. The universe remains indifferent. The story endures anyway. Maybe that's not a refutation of cosmicism. Maybe it's just what humans do. Build things in the dark, against the indifference, not because the cosmos will remember them, but because we can't seem to help it. Lovecraft couldn't help it either. Whatever else he was, and he was complicated and ugly in some significant ways, and brilliant in others, he sat down and wrote, in poverty and obscurity, stories that told the truth about something. And the truth had a longer half-life than he did. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. These explainer videos take a lot of time to put together, the research, the writing, the editing, and I'm currently a little behind on them compared to how many stories we've already covered on the channel. I'm working through them as fast as I can, and I appreciate your patience more than I can say. If you haven't listened to our full narration of the Call of Cthulhu yet, that link is in the description. No analysis, no commentary, just the story the way Lovecraft wrote it, read aloud in the dark the way it was meant to be experienced. Go give it a listen. And if this video did what I hoped it did, if you're going to read or listen to the story differently now, if that opening line hits a little harder than it did before, then it was worth every hour it took to make. We'll see you in the next one, if you dare.